Hi, everyone. I'm David Sr., and it's my pleasure to appear on your screen today to introduce this program. We're convening under the support of Printed Matter and Hauser Wirth. I'm here because I organize a space called The Classroom at the New York Art Book Fairs and LA Art Book Fairs that hosts talks and performances, screenings and the like by artists, writers, publishers, and art workers. The space was conceived by A. Bronson for the first printed matter fair at PS1 in 2008. I've been working as the organizer since then for the fair. While doing this gig for printed matter, I worked at MoMA in the library for many years, and now I'm the head of the library and archive of SF MoMA. Since that beginning in 2008, we've staged over 400 events at the fairs and involved over 1,000 participants. And I just want to recognize our community of small publishers that convenes around printed matter for the work that they continue to do and the importance of that work. The most common motive around artist publications and small press publications and their output is to fill in gaps in discourse, for creating and taking space for new writing, image making, and collaborative discourse that is self-directed and urgent. Publications document communities of artists, writers, designers, and they also create communities for folks to participate in. I'm deeply humbled by the work and energy and community that I've witnessed over the years. And the printed matter is the center of gravity for this genre and for this work. I want to recognize current fair director, Sanel Breslov, fair coordinator, Emmy Keith, fair's assistant, Sunny Iyer, and film's director, Max Schumann, for their work navigating the current challenges of proceeding with the fair in new ways. There'll be a virtual fair later this year, and it's in the planning process, and some virtual programming has been emerging on the LA Book Fair site that was supposed to happen in April. And some of the events are now available in virtual form. So thanks to Dancing Foxes, Wolfman Books, and the Black Aesthetic, Sming Sming Books and Candor Arts, Calypso Press, Seton Street Press, Siglio and Soberscope Press for their virtual panel that can be viewed at the fair website. This discussion was organized as a kind of keynote panel for April's LA Book Fair. And it's thrilling that it can go on in some way in this format. Many thanks to Hauser and Wirth's team for helping organize, and a huge thanks for the participants gathered here. The discussion Charles Gaines, The Theater of Refusal in the Age of Liberalism, takes its focus, Gaines's curatorial project from 1993, Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism, which took place at the Fine Arts Gallery at UC Irvine in 1993. It featured work by artists Jean-Michel Basquiat, Renee Green, David Hammonds, Ben Patterson, Adrian Piper, Sandra Rowe, Gary Simmons, Simpson, Carrie Mae Weed, Pat Ward Williams, and Fred Wilson. The show also hosted a reading room of sorts that gathered reviews and art writing around the artists and the works in the show, framing the conditions that these Black artists were received by mainstream critics. For the classroom program at the we had arrived at a plan to discuss Charles's new book, Palm Trees and Other Work. But for the sake of this discussion, we have transitioned to a focus on this project from 1993. Think about the essays, the thought, the discussions that went into the project and the original iteration of the show. And also now, using Mr. Gaines's own words in proposing the event, we will look at the greater level of diversity in contemporary art practice today to see how and if today's world is like or different from 30 or 40 years ago. Is the language that is used in criticism perpetuating new tropes of marginality? Is there a new framework for which we should consider what is marginalizing practice? And still quoting Charles, one point to consider is if white supremacy as a doctrine still informs the language we use to criticize works of Black artists, notwithstanding if that language is supportive or denigrating, it is still marginalizing. So from there, I'm just going to introduce quickly our panel, and then we'll begin a discussion. So First with Charles Gaines. A pivotal figure in the field of conceptual art, Charles Gaines's body of work engages formulas and systems that interrogate relationships between object and objective and subjective realms. Using a generative approach to create series of works in a variety of mediums, he has built a bridge between early conceptual artists of the 1960s and 70s and subsequent generation of artists pushing the limits of conceptualism today. Gaines lives and works in Los Angeles, and he's been a member of CalArts faculty since 1989. He's been subject of numerous exhibitions in the United States and around the world, most notably mid-career survey at Pomona College Museum of Art and Pritzker College of Art Gallery in Claremont, as well as museum survey of his grid work at the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Hammer Museum. Gaines's work is included in collections such as MoMA, the Whitney Studio Museum, Hirshhorn Museum, MCA in Chicago, Hammer Museum, LACMA, MoCA LA, and SF MoMA. Naima Keith is the newly appointed Vice President of Education and Public Programs at LACMA. Prior to holding this position, Keith was Deputy Director and Chief Curator at California African American Museum, where she guided the curatorial and education departments, as well as marketing and communications. Keith was also Associate Curator at Studio Museum in Harlem from 2011 to 2016. Cauleen Smith is an interdisciplinary artist whose work reflects upon the everyday possibilities of the imagination, operating in multiple materials and arenas. Smith roots her work firmly within the discourse of mid-20th century experimental film. Drawing from structuralism, third world cinema, and science fiction, she makes things that deploy the tactics of activism in the service of ecstatic social space and contemplation. She lives in Los Angeles and is art program faculty at CalArts. Rhea Anastas is an art historian and curator in LA. In the winter of 2004 and 2005, she co-founded Orchard, a cooperative gallery in New York's Lower East Side, which was a predetermined 3-year lifespan between 2005 and 2008 with artists Moira Davey, Andrea Fraser, Christian Philip Mueller, Jeff Price, R.H. Quaitman, Jason Simon, among others. David Platzker is a curator and art historian. His work centers on art after 1958 with an emphasis on pop, fluxus, minimal, and conceptual art. What informed those movements and successive generations of artists whose work follows formally and intellectually from these precursors. Between 1998 and 2004, Platzker was executive director of Print and Matter, where he organized numerous exhibitions and artist publications, in addition to co-founding their annual book fair. In 2004, he founded Specific Object, a bookstore and gallery dedicated to ephemeral materials of the 1960s and forward. From 2013 through 2017, Platzker was curator of drawings and prints at the Museum of Modern Art. For the publication that was originally under discussion, Charles Gaines, Palm Trees and Other Works, David contributed an essay titled A Love Supreme, Charles Gaines and Trees. Okay, so those are our panelists. And I think as we discussed, and Charles can begin to first discuss maybe some of the conditions and proposals of the original exhibition, and then the panel will go from there. So thank you very much. Charles, you have to unmute.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So, yeah, I can go back a bit and talk about the origin of the exhibition, the Theater of Refusal. It was an idea that I came up with in 1989. That was a response to something I was noticing and looking and reading the reviews of artists of color. And the first of all, I was noticing that there weren't many of those reviews because there weren't many of those exhibitions. But I noticed that that in each case, whether the work reflected the subject or not, the reviews somehow contextualized around their identity, and that I could read in the language of that textualization certain stereotypical phrases and terms that specialized the review in a certain kind of way that it was just clear that the reviewers were writing about the artists of color in a way that they weren't writing about other artists. I mean, even to the point where they would say things like, and this is what I got, was that it doesn't really look like the work of a Black artist. And where they would write about a white artist, never say, well, this doesn't look like the work of a white artist. So I thought that I would, I wanted to comment on that, and came up ultimately with an idea of an exhibition as the best way to do that. I thought about writing about it, but nobody can understand my writing. So I thought an exhibition would be a better solution. And so I put this together with the artists the same artists that make up the final roster, and spent 3 years looking for someone to collaborate on this with me. In '93, Catherine Lord, I'm so grateful to her. I heard about my efforts and asked to discuss it with me. And so we had a conversation. She said, yeah, well, I'd like to do it. She was at Irvine at the time. And so we collaborated on the exhibition. We got the artists involved, we got the works. And the framework of the show was really something that Catherine solved. That is to say that I had this critical subject, or this critical notion that I wanted to reveal and explain. It wasn't an aesthetic experience. It was really a conceptual and academic construct that I wanted the exhibition to deal with. And I really didn't know how to do that because the work itself had this strange relationship with the idea that I wanted to explore as a concept. And so I had written early an exhibition catalog even before I knew there was going to be a catalog. I had written an exhibition essay, and Catherine came up with the great idea of including sections of the text of the essay in the exhibition. So we had this two-part exhibition. One was the installation of the works that in the show of the artists that I selected who I wanted to comment on. That is that my commentary was about explaining how the language that was used to talk about their work marginalized them. And the other, of course, was this academic issue of that language itself, which meant that we had to go directly to text. And we came up with the idea, or Catherine came up with the idea of making wall text out of portions of the exhibition essay, and putting that and having that as a complementary aspect of the exhibition. Now, the important thing to me was that that these wall texts function as an analysis or just description of what someone is supposed to be looking at. It wasn't an explanation. I really regarded the whole thing as a kind of installation, so that the wall texts themselves function on some level within a context of an experience of art, and into this dialogue with the work within that experience. In the same way that one might even think that when looking at a work of art, one might have thoughts about it, that kind of dialogue, but contextualized by the exhibition. So we put it together, and it was provocatively received. There were a number of reviews of the exhibition. The exhibition traveled, and there were a number of reviews of the exhibition, and they were mixed. Some very positive, and some sort of accusing me of dealing with a subject that was not art, and was overly political and overly having too much of an interest in a particular perspective, a political perspective that wasn't available to all. And in fact, one of the worst examples of that was one reviewer accused me of of accusing writers of being sort of racist by using certain language. And one of the things I said about what I said in the catalog was that it seemed that Black artists got most of their writings during Black History Month, and so this review that accused me of being accusing reviewers of racism, that review was written during Black History Month of an exhibition of 3 Black artists. And so, and he was not aware and recognized how he was contributing to this sort of marginalization of the practice. So that's how it got started. And I don't know, I can talk more deeply about it if you want me to.
So Charles, I'll jump in. I know this is supposed to be more of a casual conversation. So just so everyone is clear, for those who obviously were not able to see the exhibition, the writer's text or the critic's text would appear in the label, basically, that would be right next to the work, or would the text be somewhere else in the exhibition?
There were two main rooms in the exhibition. One was the room of the objects themselves, the art objects. Another room that we called a library contained an edited selection of sections of my review that pinpointed what I thought were particular instances of marginalizing language. That existed in another room, along with a series of books, a bunch of books on minority art and minority artists. There was also a timeline, because another thing that we found out was that of the artists that I exhibited, we found out that there wasn't much written about minority artists until the late 80s. And when they began to be written about, the language became incredibly marginalizing. In other words, it really targeted these artists as minority artists. The problem with that at the time was that it gave, that there was a kind of interest in either justifying the work as good, even though the artists were minority, or explaining that minority artists were involved in these kinds of racial tropes that didn't really communicate well to a universal audience. And that was pretty much the language. But earlier than that, because one of the artists that I had in the show was Adrian Piper. And it was interesting that with Adrian, there was very little written. And you can see in the timeline that those reviews began to increase. And as you get to the 80s, as they increased, the only way, it was pretty clear that that writers could figure out how to write about the work of these artists was to use this kind of marginalizing language. So the focus, the critical focus of the show really played out in the reading room, which as I said, I thought was had an installational function.
Charles, do you want to make a connection between the wall panels with the critics' quotations and the chart in the reading room and the publication of the show? How that lived on beyond the exhibition in terms of how you worked on the publication with Catherine?
I think this, if I understand your question correctly, one of the dilemmas I had that I think Catherine helped me solve was how to use textual and academic material within the context of an exhibition that allowed it to be more expansive than a didactic extrapolation of a certain position. I have nothing against didacticism, but I wanted, it's very important that if it functioned that way, it would just be another excuse to marginalize the work. It was a way of saying that, well, these thoughts and these words, this language are intrinsically interlinked with the works themselves, that there's no way of understanding the work without understanding it within the context of certain kinds, a certain use of language. And if you have to, and so you have to pay very close to that language to understand how a particular culture or society itself understands and positions certain practices. And so I wanted to show that there was a very limited and very constrained way of talking about minority practices that didn't exist in the more expanded community. And the reading room was a way of showing that, but showing it in a way that is more than just illustrative, because I thought that the very concepts, the way I was looking at it, and I don't know if anybody else was, but the way I was looking at it is that the sort of the assumptions of the race assumptions that many writers had really hammered and limited and framed very broad and very sort of expansive concepts that so that if a Black artist produced a concept, then the language around that limited that concept very strictly to make this one-to-one association with their race, and this dilemma happened that it was clear to me that there was this necessity of connecting with the race, but also there's no way of talking about the work without referring to the issue of race, which was very constraining and sort of principles. And I thought that if you paid attention, sat in the reading room and went through the text and went through the wall text and the timeline, that this point would be made.
Charles, could you talk a little bit about the works that were included in the show?
Oh yeah, I'll try. It was a few years ago. I'm looking at some images on the screen, so that helps a lot, thanks. But there's the Lorna Simpson I'm seeing right now. And one of the things that I was from Lorna's series, when portrait series or series when she was photographing the backs of people, mostly women, but she also photographed men. And that reminds me that one of the problems that writers had with Lorna was they said that they couldn't understand her language and what she was trying to do, because they thought that she's writing in a secret text, a secret, I guess it's kind of a secret language that only Black people could understand. I mean, they really said that. And so rather than saying that, well, this is if a white artist had done that, you said that, well, this work is really deep, I have to really think a lot about it. But they wouldn't discount it because of the fact that they had to think about it as not art, or it was have a limited audience, but they did that with Lorna. And Basquiat was in the show, and one of the featured descriptions of him was that he was a brilliant genius, untrained and unschooled, and making a point that his race had something to do with a sort of a natural talent that education would only destroy, only encumber. And so they called him a wild child, so they looked at him as this kind of enfant terrible, type of personality whose qualities of genius was assigned to his race. And of course, the idea in that case was that it said it was indicating or playing with an idea that, I don't think I'm overstating it, that Black people don't perform well intellectually, but they are superstars when it comes to their emotions and pure and unadulterated expressions. I mean, that trope goes all the way back to expressionism and European expressionism, with the idea of tapping into the primitive mind in order to reveal a pure aesthetic. But in this case, it was the pure aesthetic. It was the same kind of function that happened with the ideas of black people make better basketball players, and black people run faster, and all that. And it sort of connected with those kinds of tropes with Basquiat. And also, it's an interesting proposition, because at the time of Basquiat, black artists started getting some recognition, and in this case, started making some money. And so in the catalog, I articulated two types of stereotype. One, the positive stereotype, and the other, a negative stereotype. And so the idea of speaking a secret black language was a negative stereotype, sort of isolating a black culture. And the idea of Basquiat as being the wild child was thought to be a positive stereotype, but the function of the stereotype is the same: marginalized practices.
Charles, I over the weekend I read the interview that's in your book. I think it happened in 1992, or yeah. And I was really stricken with, well, at that time I was actually in film school. I was studying with Trinity Minha. And so and we were reading post-structuralism quite unapologetically, which is really different from the conversation that's going on in the art world. I was really stricken also with my understanding of the margins being so different, because Minha was always talking about like operating from the margins as this space of expansiveness. And she was talking about it being a question of where are you directing your interests, or in our case, our cameras. But as I read on, I realized, especially listening to Thelma, how very much the notion of marginalization in that context was about power. And so I was just sort of like trying to parse that out in terms of my own training in a world in which all these terms were used so differently, you know what I mean? And what was really at stake at that exact same time in the art world. And then listening to Thelma and Hilton, I was trying to really, really sit with and figure out like, well, what has changed exactly? And it made this conversation have like new stakes for me in terms of more than just sort of really being excited about hearing you talk about sort of the conceptual frame around it, but the stakes of right now in terms of new kinds of economies around Blackness in particular, particularly the Black figure and things like that.
Yeah, that's, gosh, I mean, that one was told to me. I mean, one of the things that apparently people were interested in terms of the way I was describing the work in my essay, was that I was trying to use the word marginal in a different and more empowering way than the social idea of circumscribing or marginalizing a cultural group. That the issue of power that we're talking about, political power and social presence. I was trying to offer a way of looking at that legitimately contributed to a notion of the expansion of knowledge. So what I did, a very important part of my essay referred to the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and particularly chapter 10 and 1,000 Plateaus, so their theory of becoming. And Deleuze and Guattari, they had their own limitations in that book, because their notion, well, I'll put it this way, that the problem of identity was that it was a construct that had terms and borders and definitions. And when a construct or an identity is in that place, then it becomes a label that can constrain, restrain people who are named or referred to it in that way. So it's thought to have this limiting property, and that's usually the way that marginalizing language is supposed to do. It's supposed to label, name, and limit the subject that it addresses. And so I wanted to reverse that and show how this border territory can disable definitions to make a space of possibility. And I thought that Deleuze's book, offered an interesting theory about that. The problem I had with Deleuze and Guattari was that they didn't believe in the notion of identity. They didn't really believe in the notion of political or social construct. They thought that any political or framing was a limiting framework. And so what I wanted to say is that I perceived identity could be emancipatory and identifiable at the same time. So I tried to extrapolate and move into a way of, as you're saying, broaden the notion of power. Broaden this notion of power so that I would solve, I thought in that case, the problem that was set up by marginalizing language. That is that what we're living in those days, the white world. So there was two kinds of art. There was art done by social and cultural groups like Black people and so forth, and universal art, which is, now we know universal art really means white art. But in those days it was called, a universal art. And so if a marginalized person worked in those kinds of tropes that are not identifiably Black, then you could say that the work was universal and more applicable, but you deny your identity in that very moment. And so I wanted to find a way of sustaining and maintaining that identity, and at the time a function in the same space of liberation that universalism, the concept of universalism, provides. And so that was the basis of my essay, to try to make that kind of language, to try to say that there was this friction, there was this conflict set up by a binary that limited and constrained you no matter which way you turn. That either if you embrace the notion of identity, you're being constrained, or if you try to eliminate the idea of identity, you're similarly being constrained, because the only place you can go after that is white. And
it was
that. Yeah. I'm sorry.
It was that binary that actually really was really pointed in the dialogue, even when Thelma was so clear about, like, this is an institutional issue. Artists protesting on the steps of museums will not change this issue. But then there was a question of, well, what about different kinds of institutions? What are they doing? And so she kept talking about these degrees of a center, right? And I thought, the deterritorialization that you were approaching with these ideas is really where it's at for me. As I was like, there need not be a center. And I felt like by unlocking this language and really revealing, like, the difference between looking at a work versus attempting to describe it based on the markers of the artist, you very much lose their way, which is why I think arts writers do this thing where there's Black art and then we're going to talk about Blackness, and they can't see the work. They can't see anything besides what it's supposed to be telling them about Blackness, as if it's an anthropological project. And it's that binary, I think, that really produces that problem. So
but then, I mean, it gets more complicated than that, because it's like the problem that Edward Said had. The idea of structuralist writers was to sort of undermine or decenter things, as you were saying, so to get away from the binary, get away from these absolute terms and locations. But then if you're a minority person, one of the realities of your life is that you're caught in conflicts of power. And to take yourself to dematerialize or deconstruct totally, the reality of that space that's left is that you become, a feather in the wind of European universalism. That you have power. So Saeed's idea was that you can talk about decenteredness and at the same time talk about identity. So you can talk about a center and you can talk about also in that same language, the somewhat emancipatory set of possibilities from that same language. If you rethink and position the idea of the binary in the first place, so that, for example, in this case, he made the argument that what has to happen, or what does happen, is that the minority, the minority has to presume that their special experience in the world as a minority can make them, give them access to broad ideas or even address existing ideas in a unique way, and then to dominate the discourse, the general discourse, or what you call the center discourse, with this perspective, and in that way you can employ power and emancipation at the same time. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, but Charles,
Makes sense
what
to me.
about your power? When I read this essay and I think about you making this exhibition, I'm not thinking about these external forms of power or this binary. What about your life and you doing this work? It's like what Colleen said, you're putting forward a totally other kind of writing, and you're doing all this work to critique postmodern theory for its ideas of marginalization. It's like you just did this whole thing. You're putting a whole new model on the table. So it feels like straitjacketing to think about what you did only in these other terms of universalism or philosophy or aesthetic frameworks. This thing you did exploded those models of art writing.
Well, what happened was that in the way people wrote about art, there was a lot of writing about postmodern. There's a lot of postmodern theory in the writing about literature and so forth, but not about art. Art was still in the 50s in the way it was being described. And so my idea about language and important things, the importance of language, really comes from my lived experience. That to me, it's one with my identity. So I sort of introduced these ideas of decontextualization, the Deleuzian idea of becoming those kinds of constructs, but from the perspective that I think I had simply because of the particular life that I led and the life that I experienced, that it wasn't available, in the same way, obviously, but to anybody else. So I thought it was emancipatory because of what I got from others was that, well, I never really thought about using this kind of language in talking about issues of identity and race before. You can talk about identity and race in these more sort of, emancipatory phrases and tropes, and which actually came out of real and absolute concerns I had about the terms and conditions of racism, the binary, the constraints of the binary. I wanted to turn the binary upside down in such a way that that properties of it that are emancipatory could have its effect. That we don't always think about concepts and ideas as limitations for freedom, because that was peculiar. Because I was always wondered, how do you know if you've emancipated yourself into a space of freedom? Because you don't have any concepts that defines freedoms in these new spaces. You know, I mean, you have to struggle with the idea, well, if I'm in a space of emancipation, I don't know that unless I figure out what that space is. And so I was trying to find a way of addressing that and just describing a space of emancipation without being sort of bound and straitjacketed by the typical use of that binary.
How,
One of
Charles,
the-
go ahead. Well, real quick,
Sorry, go ahead, please.
So I'm curious, how did the show evolve from when you first proposed the exhibition in 1989 to when the show opened in 93? And how was that evolution informed by your conversations with artists actually in the show?
The show from 89 to 93, it didn't change. I had the same project, and I went around to everybody and they said that they weren't interested. So it didn't change at all. And when I showed it to Catherine in 92, I think I showed it to her, the changes that happened was not in the roster of artists, because we had the same roster of artists that I selected in 80 and 89, except for Ben Patterson, which was just an artist that was recommended to me subsequently. But the roster of artists didn't change, but what did change, or at least what evolved, which didn't have an opportunity to happen before, was a way of showing and visualizing the exhibition. And that, as I said, that was, I could say, I guess you could, you may not say that that's a change, because before that, the exhibition was just on paper. But once we're in conversations with Catherine, then actual possibilities evolved out of that I didn't think of before. And that all hadn't happened suddenly and around the process of talking about the exhibition and then installing it. And then, so not a lot of evolution went on in this case. I mean, I kind of understand why not. Which I won't get into here, but there wasn't this sort of this process of expansion that happened from the time I thought of the idea to the time we exhibited. But there was a lot of I can say, sort of really interesting realizations at the moment that we started installing the show and thinking about where things would go, that didn't happen before. And that to me was quite illuminating. That was a great illumination for me. That was a great part.
I wanted to come back to Charles, your conversation about binary. In particular, some thoughts that I think the other panelists might share with me about how institutions go about describing an artist. And the thing that draws my attention always is when you pick up a press release for an exhibition, and within the first paragraph, it describes an artist as in terms of their race, gender, or in some cases geography, but only when that person is non-white. And that sort of calling out immediately describes that artist as other. And I'm always surprised the resistance of institutions to not allow that conversation to happen within that sort of framework.
Yes, I mean, that was a phenomenon I've observed most of my career as an artist, even in the case when you're strained to find a political or social idea with respect to the work. And I found also that there are two ways of addressing that. There was a way of addressing it that limited the work, and there was a way of addressing it that expanded it. For example, if you take an abstract painter like Norman Lewis, many people who write about his work today argue that his work, his abstraction, is unique from other abstractionists because it was heavily iconographic, that his abstract forms had this kind of iconographic spirit, a kind of narrative spirit that was far different from this idea of pure expression. And it's claimed that that has something to do, probably to do with his blackness. Now, Lewis denied that, of course, but that was a way of talking about the work as changing the direction of painting. But on the other hand, there was a way of talking about that identity as that would, in the more classical way, marginalize the work and say that, well, this might be interesting work, but it's different from real art. It's a very tricky difference, the other thing that I noticed about that is that today more than ever, it is writers are very conscious of that. It can become very, particularly today, and talking about the work in relation to notions of politics and identity. Writers are really cautious and careful about navigating those two possibilities. With the same language, you can limit or expand the possibility of a work. And
I don't know, Charles, that's true when it comes to describing Black, Indigenous, or people of color, but it is that carefulness about describing who the artist is doesn't occur at all for white artists. And I'm of two minds of it. Sometimes I think, oh, it'd be so great if someone could just write about my work, what is there, what they see, as opposed to using it as like a tool for them to learn something about Blackness. On the other hand, it would be really interesting for them to write about white artists based on them being white. That actually would really, really clarify a lot of work that's out there right now if we had more explicit conversations about the race, the whiteness of those artists and how and what it does to shape their work. So I'm always of two minds of it. And sometimes I think, oh, it would be an interesting project to experiment with that in terms of like big group shows, like really, really doubling down, kind of the Camille Billups style. She would do this at panels where she would say, you, the white man with the red shirt and the red cap, you may ask me a question. Like she just really enjoyed doing that. Maybe that's one experiment. And another experiment is like speaking in terms of what is there and what can be seen. Because I don't think that writers now are any more careful really about this. I think they just have a bigger vocabulary to throw around. I guess that's why I jumped in.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's sort of the perfect answer to the conversation. But also, it's not about external writers. It's about the way institutions frame the art that's in the institution. Are they part of the institution, or are they something separate that are being joined into the institution? So how do we navigate these dualities and make it a single conversation where it's art within context?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I was going to say that, because you have some people, like there's a lot of feminists embrace very confidently the certain tropes of feminine to be identifiable in the work. And so you'd have that, but then you have people who don't. And the problem that I see is that when it comes to writing about minorities, whether racial or gender minorities, the ideas that are used to write about them are not of equal value. That is, they come with the idea that it's a special kind of discussion we're having around the works of women or the works of artists of color. Whereas I always thought that, when, for example, in literature, when Black writers, have deep psychological investigations into Black characters, the language, the way that's read is that, oh, these are black tropes and so forth and so on. But a Russian like Raskolnikov can be explained as universal, but he's white and he's Russian, but white Russian doesn't mean non-universal. So the idea then is that we have to embrace any subject that a black or a person of color or woman utilizes in their work as universal. That's the struggle. That hasn't happened yet. And when I talk about the parsing of the language, there are people who, of course, who don't really care about this stuff. They just have like old-fashioned notions of how art should be read and identified as certain kind of aesthetic practices. But there are people who are trying to figure this stuff out. And for those people who are trying to figure it out, it's not easy. That's what I'm saying. It's still a subject, that the kind of dilemma that happens, that I talked about in my essay, of that happens around the, I call it marginality a double-edged sword. That you're going to be cut by it no matter what. As I said, you strike your enemy with the downward blow, but with the upward swing, you cut yourself. And that's built into the language. And that's still the struggle that I think that's going on.
So I'm just looking at the time, and I just wanted to be mindful in terms of where we are in the discussion, and to also weave in some questions from our attendees. So if there are questions, please include them in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we'll make sure to weave them in. So one of the first ones we're seeing is basically, what can museums do to kind of remove that binary language that's so restrictive? What can museums, galleries, art spaces do to, focus on the exhibition, but not kind of repeat the same mistakes that has so often been used when describing artists of color's work, artists of color. Charles?
Oh, me? Actually,
anybody. I'm just
like
trying to like weave in some of the
hear
questions.
other responses to that question, because I have my 1993 opinion, and so I was wondering if anybody would else like to sort of address that question. No.
Well, I guess to add on to that question, because I could see Cauleen kind of like formulating something. Do artists feel empowered to push back on institutions that are using that type of language? Do artists feel as if they have the ability to kind of say, you know what, I don't like what's being written about my work. I don't like the way I'm being described in this press release. I know obviously there are artists of different levels. I'm obviously well aware of that, but just to say, how empowered do artists feel to engage in these kind of conversations, as well as we, ask museums to no longer kind of use this restrictive language?
Yeah, I guess that's what I was thinking about. I was also thinking about how often I've okayed some writing about my work and then reread it and thought, what was I thinking? Because we're so accustomed to this kind of language. This kind of language is sort of the way we describe Black people in this kind and so it's so internalized that it's difficult for the artists themselves to see it, especially when they're just so damn happy to have a show, let alone writers who have been sort of trained in this discourse in this particular way. But it is really all about kind of like simply saying, what would happen if you just didn't use the word Black in that sentence? What would happen to the way you describe the work? And sometimes if I even just saying that goes a long way. Not that I mind being described as Black, but just in terms of how my work is described, it's much more important to me that description be parsed out on the work than on me,
Charles, I'm curious of what your 1993 answer would be. Now, you mentioned that you would tell us through the lens of that time period. I'm curious on both thinking about this exhibition, but also kind of thinking about this question about, you know, how to think about this today. How
Well, one
would
of
you?
the things that I noticed today, and I'd like to find what David and Rhea might think about this, is that one of the problems with respect to the possibility of labeling and constraining, you know, by this binary is how to write the work of minority artists into history. Particularly, you know, in a museum, as museums purchase more work of minority artists, and I had this one experience where some again, it was I guess it was Norman Lewis was purchased by the Met, and they didn't know what room to put him in the terms that would allow his work to fit into this evolutionary narrative of history. So often it was placed in a room of new acquisitions because they don't know what to do with it, and that it seems to be something. A marginalizing behavior of this kind of work, that you don't know how it fits into the history. You know, even though Lewis was part of the development of abstract expressionism, he wasn't included by historians, and then belatedly he's being placed there, but he wasn't part of the evolutionary narrative, and so that they don't know what to do with him. I was wondering if this seems to be, in terms of writing history and museum acquisitions, if this seems to be a problem.
I think I know that the issue is that museums have real trouble when they can't define something, and that definition is both has to do with how it might look on the wall next to something else, and also how it fits into an integrated history. And that integrated history is that trope of the torpedo of history, you know, that Awkward Bar notion that all artwork should be seen in a linear fashion from one ism to the next. And when something isn't clearly defined as being within that ism, museums just don't know what to do with it. It has a lot to do, again, with the notion of race and gender, nationality, that things are often placed outside of the original context in such a way that it can only be shown within a special environment. And that's the limitation, that it's seen outside of the environment. So the challenge that museums, in particular larger museums, is to feel comfortable enough with upsetting their narratives and putting things into the collection installations in a way that is lasting, so that over time people will come to accept the change as being part of the history, as opposed to this sort of special intervention that happens on an small interval. That is something that redefines the thing, or continually defines something as being other, as opposed to it being part of the larger narrative.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think about, I think about Charles's work in this regard in particular, really, and think about the work that must be done to reconfigure history so that his work and artists like him is present there, sort of in the way that he pointed towards Ben Patterson in terms of Flexus. And I don't know if it's all completely institutional or if it's academic, if it's art history itself. Like I'm confused about that. I know when I was Thelma in 1993 is saying we need trustees, board members, directors, curators, but it's not enough if they're beholden to these linear histories that you're describing, David, is it? You know what I mean?
I'm going to jump in here and just insert a couple of questions that have been coming in. And one is by Sydney Vernon, do you think it would be useful to abolish the social definition of mainstream in quotation marks in order to secure the future freedom of Black people?
Well, I'm not sure what you want to abolish is a particular interpretation of mainstream. That the idea of the acquisition of knowledge, the idea itself is so dependent upon is sort of an accumulation of agreements, that you can call a mainstream. But there's no reason why that acquisition has to be displayed and utilized in particular ways to empower certain groups over another, or to have issues of race and gender play a part of that process of acquiring knowledge. I think the system or the manner in which we determine what are commonly held beliefs, the system can be changed. The idea of having commonly held beliefs, I don't think can change.
Okay, another question. With the present circumstances, museums have pledged to buy and support more work of Black, Indigenous, people of color artists. How can those conversations be the most constructive and positive in their efforts to diversify collections?
Colleen, please tell us what you're thinking, because you just, your face. I was
I
like,
was waiting for you, Naima. I was like staring at you.
Your face said it all. So I was just like really excited, actually looking forward to.
I was just thinking about deaccessioning in like 15 years or secondary. I was just thinking there's just gonna be this like crazy settler colonial land grab of artwork without any actual discernment or discourse or context. And in 20 years, people are going to be looking at that work. I mean, what is this? If they don't do all the other work, it's not enough to just go shopping at an art fair. It just isn't. Is that what you had in mind, Naima?
You said it, I just... I also wanted to piggyback, because John Tain also had a question about what interesting strategies do you see artists or others doing in terms of the politics of identity? And Cauleen, you specifically mentioned this idea of highlighting whiteness, which I thought was very interesting. So I guess, and a couple of people have mentioned things in the comments, but I guess for the whole panel, what strategies have we seen artists using today in terms of politics of identity? Interesting strategies, not just. Okay, not seeing anything interesting, I guess.
Well, one thing that I noticed, particularly among young artists, is that there is a change, particularly in relation to my generation. There's a change attitude with respect to the notion of the relationship of race to a practice, an artistic practice. How they see their race, whether they see it as a political construct in relation to practice. Because in my generation, race was, even among the minority artists, was embraced as a political construct within artistic practice. And that was part of the problem, because the mainstream thought that politics had nothing to do with art. But I think today, and some of the conversations I've been having, that the idea of race is seen now as a kind of sort of a natural space, or sort of a mise en scène of the behavior and activities of an artist, so that you don't have to theorize its presence in work because it's just there. I mean, and also sort of a suspicion among other certain people of actually trying to identify as a political construct the idea of race, because of this thing we were talking about, that some people feel that when you do that, once you do that, you become trapped within a certain set of constraints and limitations. I thought that was, I thought it was interesting, but I thought that it sounded very much like a more essentialist ideas of the essentialist idea of artistic practice, where I remember the Black Power movement also said that I, the work that I make as an artist of color comes out of my sort of not just my experiences, but it comes out of my genes and my molecules, and so it doesn't even have to be addressed. I mean, that if the problem is that you can interfere with that, by making white art. But if you didn't do that, and the language of that sort of natural expression was expressionism, at least in those days. So I sort of associated this idea of the acceptance of the reality of Black, which doesn't have to be theorized, similar to what was going on in the 60s with the acceptance of a sort of a biological determination that itself doesn't have to be theorized. It's simply a sort of function of existence.
Okay, I want to we're winding down a little bit. I want to raise up one comment by Fo Wilson that said, "I don't think the system can be changed by white people. In this present moment, Black people need to have opportunities to lead museums. Black folks are uniquely qualified to take us forward." And then Kyle Bellucci Johansson has a question. Has asset-driven commercial art market and increasingly powerful collector trustee class impacted this double-edged marginality? And if so, how? Has it become a triple-edged sword?
I'll say something really simple to that. We can't leave this to be sorted out by free market principles. The financialization of a couple of individuals in a really small percentage of an art market, we know what free markets do when we leave our American institutions to them. So.
Okay. Do any other panelists have any other questions for Charles, or should we leave the last word for another question in the chat?
I like this question about deterritorialization.
Yeah, do you wanna read it?
Sure. It says, Charles, you made the really important point about the need for deterritorialization to overcome being marginalized while maintaining the emancipatory potential of identity. What interesting strategies do you see artists or others are doing today in terms of politics of identity?
So I think we kind of talked about that a little bit. I tried to weave that question into the conversation. I think that's when Charles kind of alluded to the younger artists that he had been, or he has been in conversation with, but I don't know if any of the other.
Yeah, maybe I can tell you one more thing about it. That's like some of the work that I've seen that interests me. One really refreshing thing is that at least in terms of those models, those old models of the historical narrative and the evolutionary chain. I think we're in a much more sort of diverse a period of diversity where works of art are less framed around particular concept styles and strategies. There's a variety of practices out there. And I really think that this postmodern gesture, that moves us away from linear histories, I really think that is the result of the contribution of minority artists. I have to develop a linear history to prove that, but without developing that, I really think that I think this much more refreshing moment of diversity is a consequence of coming to terms with the practices of minority artists. So somehow, having a little bit a larger presence in the art world.
I think just to go back a little bit to the question that was being asked, that our history is continuing to repeat itself. That where we find ourselves today in society is incredibly related to where we found ourselves in 1968, 1969, 1970. The Art Workers Coalition at that point in time were fighting for the exact same things that are being discussed in this conversation. That the marginalization of artists of color, of people that don't confine themselves to a binary position, were the same conversations that we're having right now. And it's troubling to me that in the 1971-72 period, it all disappeared. The change in the political scene tempered the conversation going forward. And what I'm really hoping for is what one of the comments that we saw come up is that we need a wholesale change. That wholesale change has to come from both within institutions and from outside of the institutions, to not let up on the pressure to make change. That change has to be coming from people that don't look like me, towards an environment that is much more looks like you. And I think that part of the realization has to be that society is inequitable. And the art institutions that we are struggling to change are calcified in many respects in the way that their management operates. And what we need to do is to not let up pressure, to continue to think more forwardly about how institutions can look other than they look now. In particular, make sure that we don't let the change not happen.
Yeah, I want to underscore that. I mean, I started using Nizam Shaked's book on conceptual art in my class because she highlights that kind of revolutionary practice that is pretty dominant in the work in the 60s and early 70s. So, for the very artists, the minority artists, like the Art Workers Coalition and those groups, even those directed with specifically with the Black Power movements and so forth, and the kinds of pressures that they were putting on the art world at the time. And I think that's right. I think that's a very good point. That as an activity and a behavior has to continue, and I'm not sure that it hasn't, because of the incredible sort of controversies over identity and expression that's happened over the critiques of museums and exhibitions having to do with what happened to Sam Durant and Dana Schutz, and certain demands about who can speak for whom. I think it's going on out there today. I'm not convinced it's at the same level that it was in the 60s, 70s, but I think that that it's not completely dead.
I just wanted to step in here because we're at that time where we've gone over our prescribed time and we should wrap up. But I think I would just ask for a last word from Charles in terms of just a moment of reflection on this exhibition from over 25 years ago. We wanted to maybe share the link to the book. So maybe that's something that Hauser and Wirth can do in the next days on their website or something like that. So people could have access to it, free, a digital copy. And I feel like that would be beneficial to people who don't have their hands on it. I was able to get a copy through the gallery in preparation for this and really benefited from it. And also just in memoriam to Maurice Berger, who was a writer on the catalog, who passed away recently. So thank you all for the panel, and thank you so much for Charles. I really am grateful for everyone's time here. And Charles, please, if you have any last words.
No, well, I mean, I guess I would only say that I really appreciate the participation of everyone in addressing the theater, the exhibition. It surprised me that when we put the show together, it got quite a lot of notice, and then it went underground for 25 years. And so it was interesting to me that there was this resurgence of interest in the show, partly due to the fact that the issues that the show tried to address are still with us. And perhaps not completely resolved, which is kind of disappointing, but they're still with us and still having relevance. And it's very humbling to know, to see and to know that this project, somehow is still living. In fact, there is a new publication coming out that takes on the show as its subject that Rhea has been involved with, and Eric Cole-Stone, that's just getting off the ground. That's attempting to address, the effects of some of the propositions that were being investigated in the show, to try to determine how they play out in today's world. Are there new marginalizing tropes going on? Are there new categories being formed that's serving the function of separating people that didn't exist in the 30 years ago? So I'm anxious and looking forward to seeing how this book unfolds. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. We're so humble, and it's our great pleasure to speak with you about this today and to work on the book review. Jamila James too, and Catherine Lord and Fred Moten, this whole group, and all the people that have been keeping the show alive, talking about it.
Okay, so is that it?
I think so. Okay. Thank you, Charles.
It's always
Well,
good.
bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.